Today we have numerous identities, but we do have identities nevertheless. In order for there to be an us, there needs to be a them. This comes back to the principle that like attracts like. We are attracted to similarities. Those who view man as socially atomized and universally interchangeable subscribe to the Marxian point of view and cannot fully explain or comprehend how man tends to herd himself into tribes, communities, ethnicities, language barriers, football teams, political parties, etc. The dual code of man suggests that we treat our own in-group better than other out-groups. After all, where would you be today without your parents and your family who gave you a disproportionate amount of their energy? Here is an example from the Torah, one of the first 5 books of the Bible. And this, of course, is described in the ancient Hebrews. Forgive the Middle English. Thou shalt not lend upon interest to thy brother. Interest of money, interest of victuals, interest of anything that is lent upon interest. Unto a foreigner thou mayest lend upon interest, but unto thy brother thou shalt not lend upon interest, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all that thou puttest thy hand unto in the land whither thou goest in to possess it. Deuteronomy 23:20-21. So, with comparative advantage, we can still account for this part of human nature, meaning that if people tend to create natural holistic communities that they find preferable, they can still create products and goods and services, and they can trade the surplus on the market. But democracy and multiculturalism lead to identity politics. This leads to increased polarization. It is unhealthy and therefore should not be considered a subject that is above criticism. Despite the fact that there are ideological influences behind the movement of what Americans refer to as liberalism, such as Jeremy Bentham and Betty Friedan, the fact that such a radical worldview attracts up to 30% of the population might suggest a more profound implication. If we are to make a generalized statement about man, we must look towards trends that are enduring. One enduring trend of mankind is the worth of gold throughout the history of civilization. Gold, despite the fact that it has no value in producing food, is valuable because it is rare and beautiful, and thus a symbol of wealth, and thus a symbol of fitness, for whoever possesses gold would obviously have a surplus of food to trade for such a rare and beautiful object. Another symbol of fitness in traditional European culture is generosity. Professor of Medieval History Florin Curta wrote in an article entitled Feasting with Kings, linked to the right, that ancient Slavic chieftains won loyalty and hence power through the art of feasting and gift-giving. This seems to be a universal pattern among Indo-European people. From the tale of the ring-giving chieftains and Beowulf to the folkloric popularity of Robin Hood, European peoples show their fitness through generosity. Thus, like gold, Western man demonstrates that he is powerful and rich by giving away money to those who do not have any. This serves as a way to attract mates and disassociate oneself from those who are not wealthy enough to give away money and possessions. However, this ancient and enduring trend among Europeans presupposes A, reciprocity, and B, understanding. In reciprocity, it is assumed that those who are less fortunate will repay the gift giver with loyalty, and the understanding that it is strength and not weakness that leads to gift giving. Modern-day liberalism does not work because there is neither reciprocity nor understanding among alien cultures that see liberalism as a golden udder to be exploited endlessly, lest there be blood. To outside cultures, liberalism is seen as a sign of weakness and an invitation for ravaging. Hence, in order for liberalism to continue amidst multiculturalism, generosity is replaced by guilt and threats of violence. And then, finally, when the golden udder cannot give anymore, sheer metastasis and collapse. If you find yourself agreeing with this video, then you can start to take action by boycotting liberalism. Boycott television and boycott institutions that expand liberalism. After all, liberalism cannot prosper without you, the consumer, who keeps it afloat through your financial generosity. If you stop buying their propaganda, who else will be able to afford to buy it? Karl Marx was correct in stating that there are two groups of people in the world. According to his dialectic, it was the haves and the have-nots. The contradiction of these two opposing forces, however, never came to fruition, never battled it out the world over, as kin rallied to kin, time and again, in each and every mass battle ever pitched. But there is a massive dichotomy going on. A massive battle, if you will, is occurring right now as you watch this video. From the beginning of the world until now, this battle has raged. It is the battle between the makers and the takers. Man is the tool-making creature. Not having the strength of the bear, the cunning of the lion, or the speed of the cheetah, it is this aspect of man that commits his place to the top of the food chain. But man also has the greatest enemy to deal with as well: man. Since the beginning of the world, there have been two forms of people: those who create wealth with their hands and their minds, and those who steal this very wealth from those who create it. We will call these two groups the makers and the takers. Call it arbitrary and simplistic if you will, but think about it for a moment. Wealth comes into the world by the application of man's faculties to the elements in his environment. When man achieves a sophisticated enough division of labor, great civilizations emerge. Because labor is a more arduous process than stealing, the latter will always exist. But it is a secondary phenomenon. In order for there to be theft, there must be something worth stealing in the first place. Therefore, wealth creation is the primary activity of man, and theft is a secondary activity. The latter is dependent on the former, while the former must avoid the latter in order to prosper. From this observable fact, we can deduce the respective social natures of the makers and of the takers. The makers are socially exclusive, while the takers are socially inclusive. The makers wish to avoid the takers at all cost, while the takers simply cannot live without the makers. This division is so fundamental that it is beyond the use of logical persuasion. There is a line written in the sand that will forever forbid one side from coming over to the other on a collective basis, but the two sides will continue their hostile dance for eternity. The primary side, the makers, will forever try to avoid the takers, and the secondary side will forever hound the makers. We can therefore deduce the moral principle that guides these two camps. In order for there to be an environment of cohesion and production, there must be communal tranquility. Therefore, the makers will intuitively believe that the consequence of an action must fall upon the individual action maker. This is called the rule of law. The takers, however, are the great disruptors of this harmony, not out of an inherent malice, but out of a calculated desire to benefit from its fruits. Therefore, the moral principle is, by any means necessary, or the ends justify the means. This morality is a tacit admission of the takers' incapability to compete on an even playing field with the makers, for if they could, they would not risk the conflict and suffering that must inevitably occur when the makers defend themselves and their property. If it were, however, so obvious that the takers act as leeches, as vampires to a tribe or a civilization, they would inevitably be exiled and cast aside the road to rot away. Large walls would exist to deny them entrance to any town or country that they would find themselves without a host to live on. However, the takers are not fools, and with their morality have developed a cunning and a duplicity that few of the makers can comprehend or perceive. The makers must have an inborn trust in their fellow man in order to cooperate with him. He must see his fellow man as similar to him, understanding the concept of mutual benefit. If he didn't have this mentality, then there would be or could be no social cohesion, and society would cease to function. The takers, however, are deceptive. Their method is fraud and sham. The takers' weapons are guilt, lies, and euphemism. They develop systems of thought that attempt to frame questions and answers in an unnatural way so as to favor their own desired outcome, which is the transfer of wealth away from the makers and towards the takers. So long as they are perceived as being other than thieves, and so long as they dress up their base desires under the ruse of religion, compassion, and charity, they will always find fresh victims to deceive. Because the inborn defenses of the makers is always catching up, the method of the takers is always evolving. The principal method of the takers was, in olden times, simple plunder. However, this method was highly costly for them when the makers defended themselves and their property with full force. Today, however, the takers use taxation in order to plunder. This attracts a cadre of the super-rich and powerful that wish to guide the mob of takers to their own benefit in their quest and thirst for ever more power. Thus the takers will always find traitors amongst the midst of the makers who wish to be leaders of the takers when they recognize that they can benefit from them. So what are the makers to do when their walls are breached and they find themselves victims of the highest moral outrage, that is, theft, the method of which is violence? A maker denies the concept of progressivism and progress, for the nature of man is set in stone, at least for eons to come. The takers seek to shatter differences and destroy local autonomy, while the maker revels in competition and the innate differences of man, which are responsible for the division of labor, which in turn is responsible for civilization and economic growth itself. The principal self-defense tool of the makers is secession. Secession can come in all forms, but first the makers must recognize that they are victims of plunder and that the guilt they feel for their desire of independence does not serve them, but serves the very people that are exploiting them, the people who create guilt as a weapon for theft. Secession for the makers does not mean autarky. It does not mean hiding away in the woods and eking out a subsistence-level living. Secession means a rejection, first and foremost, of the system of exploitation that they find themselves in. Second, it means living in accordance with the principles of dignity, which means boycotting all of the institutions that participate in the enslavement